Welcome, everyone, to the Inclusion Podcast. I'm Dr. Julie Costin.
And I'm Dr. Christy Preddy-Franzak. We're so glad you're here as we explore all things inclusion.
So whether you're a school leader, an educator, a parent, or simply passionate about inclusion, this podcast is for you.
In each episode, we go beyond the usual conversations, diving into what truly makes inclusive education work.
Together, let's make a difference, one conversation at a time. Here we go. We're here, episode 36, and 36 is my favorite number for no good reason, except I think it's a very cute number, just 36. I don't know why.
It's a favorite topic of yours, so that's like totally serendipitous.
It sure is. So today is about paraprofessionals, and it's about how to fade support. So often we see paraprofessionals in what we call the Velcro phenomenon, or side by side with the student, or sitting right next to them. And as many of you know, the goal is really to fade support to independence or to interdependence. And a lot of people will say, yes, I get it. I totally understand why fading is important. But how do you do that?
And I think, Julie, I was thinking about this in preparation of this episode because I always remember this is how we got together was through this word paraprofessional. And I always misunderstood the prefix of para. And when, you reminded me that it means alongside. So then it becomes a little bit more confusing in my head, because if a paraprofessional is working alongside a teacher, but I'm assigned to a student to be a para, everything's telling me be right next to them. Maybe I'm a one-on-one. Maybe I am even personally hired to be with this student. So if I fade my support, am I doing my role or what else am I doing? So I know that we're going to get into all of that, but I was even thinking the name suggests that I'm right there alongside.
Yeah, well, just remember it's a paraprofessional, so you're alongside the professional. So you're alongside the teacher or the educator versus the student.
Okay.
And then one-to-one and all those phrases and words and thoughts about what support really looks like in schools can be very confusing. But what we're going to do today is talk about the research behind this work, and it suggests that even if a para is hired to be with a particular student, you want that paraprofessional to be trained to fade their support or to help that child be supported by peers and to sort of arrange that, as opposed to constantly be side by side with the student. We won't get into the research today, but the research suggests that there's paraprofessionals can get in the way of academics for kids, they can get in the way of behavior for kids, and they can get in the way of social relationships for kids, almost in equal measure. And we're hiring paras to be supportive, so we don't want to have the detrimental effects or the deleterious effects that we so often see when paraprofessionals are hired or utilized in school settings.
And we're going to get into today's download will be one strategy for fading support. And Julie and I have talked about this strategy elsewhere, and we'll link to it in the show notes. But we want to first make sure that it's really clear about how any part of the training for paras is inclusive of fading support. So the download for today is at our website, in the show notes, or anywhere you're listening to this podcast at inclusiveschooling.com/download 36. And it's all about the prompting ladder, which we'll highlight towards the end of this episode. But really, we want to stay here for a minute and talk more about how do you train, how do you prepare, how do you ensure fading support, and again, just re-highlighting in the show notes and in our conversation why that's important.
Yes. And if you're interested in the research around this work, Michael Giangreco's work is my favorite. It's the most comprehensive work out there around how do we need to fade supports. So A lot of times people will say, sure, yeah, I'll fade my support, but you don't understand. This kid has trouble with mobility. This kid has trouble with cognition. This kid has trouble with, and they name all the different things, or they have seizures and I need to be right there, or. And it's like, yes, all of that may be true. And we want you to think about these questions that help you to fade support. So, Christy and I are going to share with you 5 questions that help teams understand how and when to fade support. The first one is, during what activities or time periods is it absolutely necessary to be physically near the student? So this is great because people usually say, well, anytime they're doing academics, I need to be sitting next to them. Nope, I want you to get more specific. Well, actually, anytime they're using a keyboard to type on, I do need to be there for safety because whatever. Okay, so keyboard activities, fine. What else? And you start to just narrow it down and down and down and down. And too often we think it's all activities as opposed to just a few. So we start to think about, when do we need to be next to this kid?
Well, and Julie, let's stay on that one for just a second because you often talk and encourage people to collect success minutes, which I want you to define here in a second.
Mhm.
But one of the things that paras can do is collect data in general and something specific. So in this instance, as Julie invites the team to consider which activities or times or moments or interactions do we really need to be physically near the student? This might be something to have some data on to know, when is the student being successful and did they really need physical proximity for that success? So tell us a little bit about collecting success minutes so that a para knows what they might collect data on to answer that question.
Yeah, so well, I see them as 2 different things. So I'm okay, success minutes, is when is the student being successful? So you're really legitimately looking at how can they be successful? When are they successful? How many minutes in a row can we be successful? And we're always trying to gain more minutes that way. And when it comes to proximity data, I usually think you start to play with your own proximity. So a paraprofessional might be 10 feet away and notice what happens. Try to be 5 feet away, notice what happens. What supports do you have to put in place in order for the kid to be successful? So there's a lot of different things to take data on, that the goal being, how do we help the student become more independent or more interdependent with peers?
And I think what I was going for, Julie, was
Mhm.
that can they be successful with you 10 minutes away? So I was combining those two
Yeah.
ideas to say, when they are successful, can I realize that I don't need to be as close as I thought I needed to be?
Yeah. Yeah. So 10 feet away, a lot of times, if you can touch the student, you're too close.
Okay.
And so that's what we usually, arm's length to begin with. It's so interesting when I did a lot of training just with pairs on this, and they would take one step back from being in physical proximity, and they would be like, I did it, I'm fading. And they would have their full eyes on the student. It's like, no, 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 nobody thinks you're fading. You're still really engaged in a supportive way. So, how do you move your body away so that the kid has independence and they can have some agency and they can connect with other children and things like that?
Well, and Julie, as people are fading their supports, I guess the next question in our list really lends itself to kind of help wean us as well. So if we are finding there are times where we have convinced ourselves, or it's quite obvious that the student does need us to be within arm's length or closer,
Mhm.
what's our next question?
So during those times, then can you fade to independence? So is that possible? So there are some kids with certain skills that they're not going to be able to fade to independence. So you just go, okay, this isn't going to be possible for this particular thing. Fine. Then you say, can it be done with the support of a peer? So can it be done with interdependence? So let's just say it's a child who doesn't have the mobility to get out their textbook and open to page 27. Okay. So a lot of times paraprofessionals will zip right over, get out their textbook, open to page 27. And a different way to approach that is to say, ooh, this is the perfect moment for the students sitting around that child to help them get out their book and open to page 27. They're eager to do that. They're excited to do that. And it's likely to create a little bit of a social interaction between kids as opposed to para to student.
And I think that ties into the next question, and I'm gonna kind of steal a little bit of our thunder for the final question, but can
Mhm,
anyone else in the environment provide more natural supports? Anytime I see the question, Julie, about environments, as you well know, I
mhm.
channel Maria Montessori and I think about the environment as the third teacher. Reggio inspired programs also talk a lot about the environment being a third teacher. And so the idea, though, we've combined the environment with more natural supports, which just means part of the ongoing activity. So peers are hopefully a part of that. Let's say you hire me as a para, having a middle-aged white woman in that play environment isn't as natural as maybe other kids of the same age or grade and
Mhm.
or whatever materials are already there or part of the scenario. So I like that question as well, that as you're thinking about helping the student be more independent or you're thinking about peers to promote interdependence, thinking even more broadly about the environment itself and how our natural supports embedded into the environment so that we don't have to use human supports.
So in that example with finding page 27, something like a sticky note already marking page 27 would be an example of what Christy's talking about. So the sticky note's already been put in there, the para is nowhere near, and the kid now knows how to get there. Let's say numeration is a challenge, and so that's where they're struggling to get to page 27. So that's just an example of an environmental support. And then the next question that we ask people to think about is what changes to the classroom structures or content might help the student become more independent or interdependent. And the kinds of things when we say classroom structures or content is, can you pair the students in different ways? Can you have them in center based work so that they have a role to play as opposed to they do all of the aspects of it? Is cooperative grouping used, and how could it be used better so that the structural aspects make it very natural for the student to be able to be successful with the things they can be successful and they won't need support in the same way?
Well, it's like you always say, Julie, about when we talk about like recordables.
Yeah.
So the idea is I give the directions and then students go off to their activities or centers or independent work. And somebody invariably is not going to have listened. I mean, I'm at dance lessons sometimes and I'm thinking about something else or I space off and the teacher says, this is the amalgamation of patterns we're going to do. And I have to admit, I have to say, hey, Evan, I wasn't listening. Can you say that again? But it's low stakes for me to say that.
Mhm.
You know, if I were in my biology or health ed class in high school, I never would have said, "Oh, I'm sorry, teacher, I was spacing off. Can you repeat the instructions?" So having something in the environment, kind of a blend between the previous question and the structures, something like a recordable that restates the directions can start to provide I can be more independent without having to come up to your desk or where you are in the classroom and ask you to repeat it.
Yeah. Even having a peer or a strategy called ask 3 before me, which is
Yeah.
ask 3 friends before you come to the educator, any educator, paraprofessional or otherwise. So I have to work on my skills of finding a friend and asking them before coming to an adult support. So that's just another example of a structure that might be really useful.
And Julie, I thought before we showed the ladder of support or the prompting
Mhm,
ladder, or the ladder of independence, we call it lots of different things. We could
mhm,
just remind folks that as paras are fading their support, what are some things they could be doing that
mm,
aren't maybe that connected to or that Velcro or that
mm.
within arm's length of the student, but they still have a vital role in the classroom being successful?
So many things, but we've got a long list here, but things like they could run their own station. So the student that they're supposed to be supporting still could be within eyeshot or earshot, but they're running a station or they're reading a book or they're thinking about how to make instruction multisensory or they're programming devices for the next thing that's coming up or being just a play partner. I say just, but it's probably the most important thing to do in a early childhood classroom is to be a play partner or to think of themselves as a co-regulator or a stress reducer. There's just a million things they could do. They could prepare upcoming materials. They could take data and just so many other things that will give them another task that's much better served than sitting next to a student.
Excellent. Okay. So as we wrap up this episode, you're going to want to get the download and you're going to look at the show notes because we're going to give you links to the research that Julie has mentioned. We're going to give you links to more or expanded versions of the prompting ladder. But we did want to share it just as one other way that paras can specifically, strategically, I guess maybe systematically fade their support. So we're not going to go into great detail, but you'll find the download at inclusiveschooling.com/download 36. It's all about the prompting ladder. We give you lots of examples, but we're just going to talk about how we might use the ladder as if we're scared of heights is a strategy for systematically fading support, especially, Julie, if we started off with something like a verbal or visual prompt, or maybe even a full physical prompt at the top of the ladder. So kind of orient if folks are driving or painting their house and not able to see the prompting ladder. Let's talk a little bit about what's on it and how to systematically use it.
Yeah, so we use this to train paraprofessionals, teach paraprofessionals what are the least intrusive supports. And so picture a ladder and picture on the bottom it says least intrusive, meaning most natural, right? All the way up to the most intrusive or most, I'll say, problematic for kids. And so what we're going to ask people to do is approach the ladder as if they're afraid of heights. And they only want to go up as high as they have to and back down as quickly as they can. So if we start at the bottom, it's invisible or material supports. The example of putting a sticky note in a book is a material support that's nearly invisible to anyone else, right? So all the kids are getting out their books, and this kid, bloop, they can turn right to it just because there's a quick material support there. A natural cue would be the second rung up. Wait time is the third rung up. A gestural cue is the fourth rung up. And I'll just pause there to say the goal is you go up only as high as you have to and back down as quickly as you can to keep your prompts as unintrusive as possible. So students have their own agency and they're able to make their own decisions and they're able to seek support from their friends as opposed to always relying on the adult who is paid to be with them, because we all know that in the future, there won't necessarily be an adult at the ready to support. So what we have to do is help kids become as independent as possible.
And so as Julie said, you only go up as far as you need to. Some of you might already start mid-ladder or near the top of the ladder. So if you're a para, your goal would be to have a conversation with other team members. If you are providing support and training to paras, it would be to have a conversation with them. Where do you currently support this student most often? Which rung of the ladder? And then how can we start to fade that support? And that means how can you take a step down the ladder and provide a less intrusive support while still maintaining the student's success? So you can get the prompting ladder examples and definitions, as well as additional examples about how to fade support and the research behind this sort of call to action for all paras at inclusiveschooling.com/download 36.
Thank you for tuning in, and don't forget to subscribe and catch up on past episodes where we share valuable insights, straight talk, and practical steps to challenge outdated special education practices. You can find every episode with the show notes at inclusiveschooling.com/inclusion-podcast to build more inclusive schools together.